This is Defender Radio. I'm Michael Howie, and this is Defender Radio, the podcast for wildlife advocates and animal lovers, brought to you by the Fur Bearers. Black bears in British Columbia face an impossible reality: find new places to live without being near people, while we continue to remove habitat and ecological connectivity from the landscape. It's a struggle that journalist and documentarian Paul Johnson wanted to profile in hopes of making a change. Bears in Our Backyards: The Struggle to Survive with Humans is Johnson's latest full-length documentary and features extensive footage of black bears in British Columbia, along with interviews from experts, advocates, and government officials. The documentary is poignant and shows the precarious situation we've created for black bears, and how our attitudes towards wildlife coexistence can set us all up for success or failure. Paul joins Defender Radio to share more about what motivated him to create the documentary, how his time as a television journalist with Global BC shapes his views of the issue, and what we can all do to create the future for ourselves and black bears that we want to see. Why don't we get started a little bit about what led to the creation of Bears in Our Backyards: The Struggle to Survive Around Humans. It's a great documentary that's available now, and I think people will be curious as to sort of what made you, a journalist, a reporter, decide to take on this project in a bigger way.
You know, a lot of these projects that turn out to be good and that get completed and that you end up really liking and that people like and resonate with, they don't begin from, some kind of rigorous process of, business goals. They begin through happenstance and hunch. Mm-hmm. You're a journalist as well. I mean, I think you would get that. Your reporter's instinct goes off at some point and tells you, this is an interesting issue and I ought to look into this more and I ought to explore this more. Really, the launching point for this has to do with the fact that I'm still a working daily reporter for Global News in British Columbia. Been doing that for a very long time. I'm a general assignments reporter. I have a focus where I kind of cover a lot of conservation and environment and resource issues, but I could do anything on any day. And I'm still into that. And there was one day about 4 years ago, and I was sent up to one of the reservoirs in the North Shore. I don't even remember what the story was we were doing up there. We might have just gone to that place to meet somebody for an interview for another story. And I was walking along a path, and I encountered this person who'd set up a tent, kind of a kiosk situation with a table and a bunch of materials that they were distributing about bears, about black bears specifically, and about the need for people in the community to be more aware of what was going on with black bears and managing attractants around their yards, knowing that black bears live in that community, that it's their home originally, and people ought to not be overly afraid of them, but cautious around them. Mm-hmm. And I got to talking to the person who was there, and it was a young woman named Lucy Cadman, who was with a group called the North Shore Black Bear Society. And I had, some time to kill, and I was fascinated by what she said. And it just immediately struck me, this is one of those blind spots that we have about a thing that's going on. It's right in front of us. It's, as the title of the film says, it's in our backyards. And we've not been paying adequate attention to what's going on here. And there's a lot that needs to be done. And in fact, this is one of the most fascinating stories that's playing out across British Columbia and Western Canada. Again, literally right in people's backyards, right in front of our homes, which I think is counterintuitively one of the reasons why there's sort of a dismissive, sort of blasé factor about the issue of black bears when we bring them up, because they are kind of ubiquitous and most people have a story, and they're thought to be everywhere. And often in these cases, nobody kind of cares about that. And I thought that was wrong. And I had actually, at that point in my life, never seen a black bear in my life. But
Sure.
never, I mean, I'd seen them obviously in television and in media, but I'd never in the flesh seen a black bear. It just hadn't happened. So I started to think about this, and I called Lucy back and we talked some more, and I wanted to explore what was going on. And what disturbed me about this was the stories that she said about incidents where black bears were getting killed by conservation officers merely because they happened to be doing what bears do, coming down, and they were foraging in backyards, they were flipping over garbage cans, maybe getting into fruit trees, those kinds of things. There was not one case that we were aware of at that time where these bears had actually hurt anybody. While black bears certainly do have the capacity to be dangerous, to be very dangerous, they're mostly not. And for people who are paying attention, the risk of black bears, I don't have the stats to support this, but again, gut reporter's instinct, I think the risk to the general public from black bears is substantially less than the risk from other people's dogs on a national basis in terms of bites and even fatal dog attacks.
Yep.
And we cover one of those actually in the film.
Yes.
So I started to become aware of this, and this struck me that this is a problem. This is a human wildlife interaction problem that's not happening somewhere up in a remote part of Canada, but is happening right here where most of the people in the province live. It's happening in places like the North Shore of Vancouver, like Pitt Meadows, like Harrison Hot Springs, like Mission. And as I later found out, it's happening on Vancouver Island. It's happening in the Kootenays. It's happening around Prince George. It's happening everywhere where people live, and there are black bears. And so much could be done. So many simple, very cheap things could be done to improve our relationship with black bears, to result in many fewer of them being killed. And that was sort of the question and the premise from which I got into this. And so I started taking my video camera, and I got a long lens to be able to shoot wildlife effectively, started going out to places around the Vancouver area where I could drive to and to encounter black bears just to see what was going on with them. You know, what are they like? You know, what do they do? And I ended up spending a lot of time tramping around in the woods on trails and paths and filming black bears. And it was great. And it's one of the most incredible things I've done.
And I'm curious, from that day when you first learned black bears are being killed in this way, and it's often because of these what sound like mundane reasons, and truthfully, it's what raccoons in Toronto do on a daily basis, right? It's get into things. It's, oh, you left something out, I'm going to check it out, and maybe I'll eat it. And that it was leading to all of these killings. What was your reaction to that? Was that a very like a light bulb moment? Was it driving for you? Or was it, having been in the media business for long enough, sort of a recognition of, oh, that's too bad, but not surprising?
Well, I was disturbed more than anything else. Yes, it was a sort of a, hard-boiled newsman sense. Yeah, you're right. This is not surprising. This is what happens when the big hand of government gets brought in. But it disturbed me and bothered me on two levels. And here we get into a world that's different from other people, and everybody's got different takes on this. And this speaks to, I guess, your moral outlook on the relationship between people and wild creatures. So the first thing that it struck me about this was, well, are these in fact what you would call justified killings? Are the bears that are being killed here, are they actually a real threat to people? Because at the end of the day, I would think that's the only reason that could justify killing a black bear and ending its life. It's a threat, and it's an imminent threat. Has it done something? And as I started to hear about the different stories, mostly from people who'd experienced them, some of them were activists like Lucy Cadman, who, have a known, dog in this fight and a position, but others were just people living in the communities. Some who really had no opinion about black bears and were aware of them. Some who were aware of the situation and didn't want them to be killed. And then others who were, if the bear's a problem, we can't take that risk. But from all of those conversations, it really started to strike me that these bears didn't necessarily need to be killed in many of these cases. There was one that appalled me very early on, and it was a bear called Plum. I have a picture of Plum in the movie. And Plum's deal was she was coming down and getting into a plum tree in a woman's backyard in North Vancouver. She knew where it was, and she knew what the food was, and she knew when those plums were going to be ripe. And she would come down and she would climb that tree and hang out in it for several hours and gorge and eat all of the plums, which is amazing. I get that. I feel like that sometimes too, so I can relate. Right?
Yeah.
So this was happening, and the woman in question, as the story goes, who had the plum tree, she knew that bear. That bear knew her. They had established some boundaries, which is another interesting thing you realize about black bears. And she didn't have a problem with it. Plum would come, Plum would eat the plums and then leave. Somebody else in the community was alarmed at the presence of Plum coming and going, and they were scared. And when the plums were gone, Plum got into, I believe, somebody else's garden. And the story, as I understood it, was that person was afraid, called in Conservation Officer Service, and they came down and they killed Plum. And the justification is apparently there's actually a rule in the books that you can, quote unquote, destroy a bear if it damages somebody's property. And things growing in your garden can be considered your property.
Yeah.
And I thought this was an incorrect reaction to the actual threat that Plum the bear was posing to the community, and that did not rise to the level of taking Plum's life. So that was one thing. The other thing, and this gets more deep into the philosophy of how humans and animals relate, is what gives us as people and as governments the authority to take the lives of these wild animals? Who says we're in charge? As you start to research this story, and if you talk to government scientists and officials in the Conservation Officer Service, most of whom, by the way, I believe are good people trying to do the best with the situation they have at hand, they talk frequently about, they'll use the word manage. We need to manage these populations. And we're currently managing the wolf population because we're concerned that the caribou could be affected. These kinds of things. I'm inherently skeptical of these for a lot of reasons. First, we've seen enough situations around the world where attempts to manage one type of creature or wildlife have gone just appallingly off the tracks and end up with all kinds of unintended consequences, and they don't work. But the other thing, and I think this especially needs to be taken into account when you're talking about highly sentient, intelligent animals like black bears. What gives us the right to decide that we get to manage them? And lethal force is something that we can arbitrarily decide to use. And what are the rules around this? And I was fascinated by this. And my hunch was we really don't have good rules, or the rules are still evolving. And I wanted to have a voice in this debate because I don't know that we as people have the right to take the lives of wild animals just because the government in your jurisdiction passes a law that says you can.
It really leads into those broader conversations that many of us have about issues like the North American model of wildlife conservation, which is very much behind a lot of what you're talking about in philosophy. And that's the idea that humanity has a responsibility or duty to manage wildlife populations. And it starts with the assumption that we have to use them as resources. And when everything we do is based on a philosophy that begins with viewing wildlife as a resource, it stands to reason that everything that comes out of it is going to keep going back to that as well. And I think that's what you've described and what the documentary shows is there are rules and regulations in place that don't consider black bears individuals, that don't consider them members of a family or part of an ecosystem that play an important role. They consider them data sets that need to be managed because that's our responsibility. And I think there's more and more data coming out. There's more and more people and thought leaders coming out who are showing that's just not necessarily true. And I think you've got great examples through the documentary with some of the folks you interviewed, and you talked about this. There was one gentleman who said, he was standing and cooking in the kitchen one day, and the back door was open, and it was a rainy day, and he turned around, didn't really notice, thought from the corner of his eye it might have been a dog, but nope, it was a big black bear standing at the back door, sniffing into the air and smelling his soup. He told him to calmly go away, and they left. And it left him with this wonderful moment of connecting with nature, connecting with an animal, no harm, no change to the behavior, they're not feeding, but also made him feel good about his soup, which I thought was quite sweet.
David Porter, yeah.
Yeah, and that's so many people I've spoken with who spend time around black bears or other wildlife. They have those stories where it's, I saw a bear. I told him to move along, and he moved along. In fact, I got an email today. I've just written about some of that stuff, about the talking to a bear and encouraging them to move along. And I got someone back today in BC, I don't remember where exactly, who said, I ran into a black bear for the first time last week. I said, I'm coming down this path. You may want to move. Stood there. The bear looked at him. He looked at the bear walked on, and his hike went on without issue. And that's what more and more experts I've heard from are saying too. So I am curious. I mean, we have one set of people who are seeing bears with curiosity and reverence and joy, but others see them as terrifying or pests or resources that need to be exploited. How do we bridge that divide of, being enthralled by the presence of a black bear to being terrified in the presence of a black bear?
Well, this is exactly one of the questions that I've struggled with, and it's one of the things I set out to try to talk about and illustrate and explore in the film. Barack Obama, one of his biggest lines that in those years when he was such a renowned orator that vaulted him into the presidency, one of the things he said was the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. And he might have been quoting somebody else there. I feel like what's going on with our relationship with wildlife, and in particular with black bears here, there's a similar thing going on. And the problem is we have miscategorized them. As you said, resources, pests, nuisance to be managed, instead of fellow creatures making their way and trying to get by on planet Earth as members of a larger family. And especially at a time of biodiversity loss, when we're losing so many different species, or the numbers of the ones that are still around are declining, we need to look at our fellow creatures, our fellow non-human creatures, as companions on our trip through planet Earth and our time here, and not view them as resources to be managed. That being said, sure, black bears can be dangerous. And, even some of the people who love black bears the most, like committed black bear people like Brian Nawin, who is the first guy you see in the film, he even says, if you get to the point where you have a black bear that is repeatedly entering homes and shows no fear of people and is a problem, he's not against lethal measures in certain circumstances. But the numbers in British Columbia right now don't show that at all. In fact, they show the opposite.
Yeah.
More than 500 black bears killed by the government last year, according to their numbers. It's possible that number is actually higher. So, but let's take them at their word in the lower number. 500 bears, and that seems to be the number that they're killing every year. I don't think there's any remote chance that that corresponds to 500 legitimate threats to people. In fact, I know it.
Yeah.
And this means that this miscategorization we have of these animals is leading to an unjustified slaughter. And that really is the most distressing thing that I think inspired me to want to make this film.
I'm curious to talk about some of this too, because you have the unique opportunity. You've created this documentary, you're passionate about the issue, but you're also a journalist actively. So I'm curious, I've given a lot of talks on media sensationalism, particularly related to wildlife and certain breeds of dogs and whatnot. I'm curious from your perspective, as you've moved through this sort of journey of understanding about black bears, the issues facing black bears, and I know you very specifically said they're killed, and that's something at the Fur Bears we talk a lot about is the language we use and stuff. I think maybe to start, let's talk about that specific, that euthanized versus destroyed versus killed. You chose the language killed, but in the media, we frequently hear euthanized or destroyed, which is used by government officials.
Yes.
Do you think this is an intentional separation that's encouraging the issue to sort of be this disconnect between us and nature? And do you think that by actually using the language of what we're doing, we're maybe being more honest or getting people closer to the reality of the news that we're telling them?
Yes, I think it's intentional spin on the part of the government to use the wrong words. By the way, in my reporting, you won't hear me use euthanize
Yep.
unless it actually was a case where they euthanized the bear. The bear was suffering, it was languishing, it had been hit by a semi-trailer. We put it out of its misery. That's euthanasia. Killing a bear because it was in a plum tree and then went and dug up somebody's garden and then somebody else was afraid of it, that's not euthanasia, which is, by the way, how they described the killing of Plum when that happened.
Yep.
I've been around a while, so as I guess, an older member of the cynical tribe of, the ink-stained wretches, although I work in TV, there's a certain amount of sort of peevishness that I view and that I bring with me when I'm talking to the government. And when they say, yeah, we destroyed the bear, I will just say, well, you didn't destroy it, you killed it. That was your intention, and that's what you did. And they don't usually respond. I mean, they know what they're doing, but I don't use those words. When you hear those words repeated by news reporters, it's laziness. And maybe laziness is a little hard. It's not thinking it through. And people are under deadline and they're trying to do a number of different stories. And they're also probably not familiar actually with the subject matter, and they just haven't thought it through. You euthanize a creature that is suffering and and is being humanely put out of its suffering. These bears are killed, and it does have an effect. And when I do talk about it, when I do report that they killed the bear, they killed a mother bear and two cubs because they were in situation X on Vancouver Island, and we determined it was necessary in consultation with our biologists, and relocation wasn't a possibility. I don't say they euthanized the cubs. I say they killed them. That's what they did.
Yeah.
They decided, according to their methods and their ideas and their processes, these animals have to die, and we did it. And so report it as such and report it for what it is. You're killing the animal.
Yep, it's one of those things. I think that critical thinking of what you're being told sometimes does get a lot harder when newsrooms are shrinking and deadlines are increasing. But I one of the things that comes up a lot, and I get asked this a lot, is the concept of it bleeds, it leads. And I don't know that that was ever actually said out loud in my 12 to 13 years in newsrooms, but it certainly was quietly implied, because if there's an excitement behind a story, if there's drama behind a story, well, you might get above the folds. You might get the first 5 minutes. You might get the promo, right? It's, as a journalist, that's the home run that you're going for constantly as a professional. But I think maybe sometimes it's easy to leave beside the idea that we're actually having an impact as well. Do you think that is still an issue in newsrooms, that chase for those exciting stories that leads to, in essence, the if it leads, it bleeds format? Or sorry, if it bleeds, it leads.
Sure, absolutely. And I don't necessarily disagree with that or believe that if it leads, it bleeds philosophy is bad. I mean, you get a mass shootout between warring gang factions in Burnaby, BC at 4 p.m. on a Thursday. That's going to lead the 6 o'clock news, and it should.
Yes.
So there is that. But part of what's going on, and curious what your take would be on this, my sense of from what stories become highly promoted, highly covered, repeated stories, and what don't, has to do with the fact that the core problem, if you're working in the daily news industry, is that on most days, there's nothing going on.
Yep.
Most days of the week, most calendar days of the month, there actually isn't a blaring headline that yet people need to pay attention to, and if they don't, to their detriment. There are some days when there absolutely is. When the pandemic lockdowns began, you needed to be paying attention to the news because your lives were going to be affected. If there's a forest fire in your neighborhood, if there's a gang war down the street from you, yeah, paying attention to the news could be very helpful, and you ought to. But those things are actually infrequent. And this is, the problem and the challenge of the news industry is to produce stories that are still going to interest viewers, even on the days when there's nothing happening. Because there's not a single news media outlet that's out there that would be able to stay in business if people were only paying attention when there was legitimate big breaking news happening. So this creates this incentive and this chasing for attention and trying to get content to chase eyeballs and maintain people's interest. Social media does the same thing too in the way they set up algorithms to keep people interested. So in the news business, and you're right, that often, but not always, means a tendency to go for what seem to be the most salacious, the most titillating, the most voyeuristic stories that you can grab somebody's attention with, that you can claim that this is a new thing or that this is an important thing, or that you could be in danger if you don't pay attention to this. Now, responsible journalists and the editors who oversee them will make sure that these stories that you're doing on the slow news days are still fact-based, and that they're not overdone and they're not over embellished. And different newsrooms have different capabilities of doing that. I'm not going to name any names, but I'm sure if we start thinking about the different publications and outlets that are out there, there are some that I think if you follow them for a period of time, that's a legitimate news story. I'm glad I know about that. That's important. This, on the other hand, well, that's a bunch of just pumped up BS. And some do more than the others. And so, where do bear human conflicts fit into this? Well, they can get right into this mix of the if it bleeds, it leads phenomenon. And in a poorly managed newsroom, they can be overblown. We've seen, for instance, recently, there was a big story about a bear that got into a cabin in Arizona, a black bear. And I think there was a young boy or a teenage boy in there. Nobody was hurt in that case, but it was just, this terrifying incident of a child or a young person in a cabin, and there's this marauding bear, and it's coming in whether you like it or not. Well, okay, that's a story. I don't think it's necessarily unethical that newsrooms and websites would be repeating that story and talking about it. But what we didn't see in any of the coverage of that was even a line in the bottom where, quoting the ranger from the local ranger station, we got a lot of black bears around here, but they're mostly never a problem and nobody is usually ever hurt. In fact, I find a good way to put this into perspective with people is more people are hurt by dogs than by black bears, way more people.
Yep.
And, so how do you balance it? Do you put a little bit of nuance in it at the end? And of course, we did not see that with the story of the marauding black bear, and we seldom do. And there's a tendency, again, in the ongoing competition for eyeballs and attention, to play up stories of crazy marauding black bears doing things. We've seen it in the movies, cocaine bear, right?
Yeah.
So, what do we do with this? I think we just try to learn more about the personalities of bears. And for me, I really learned a lot in producing this film. And if you look in the very first scenes of the film, there was a sleeping mother bear that I encountered early one morning in Port Coquitlam. And that was a real powerful moment for me. I'd been filming a lot of bears up till that point. And I was walking along a path when I saw something off to my left. And actually, at first, it looked like somebody had thrown away a rug or a blanket or something, because I just saw this dark spot on the ground. And then I looked over and I saw it was moving. And I saw, oh, it's breathing. This is a big black bear. I'm going to film this. And I was a good distance away. And I started just shooting the bear. And she was waking up. And it was beautiful to see this bear in the morning kind of open her eyes and look at the sun, and then was like, nah, it's too early, going back to sleep, yawned, went back to sleep for a bit, did this again a few times, stretched just just like I would in the morning.
Yep.
And then I heard some noises in a tree, which was actually much closer to me. And I looked up in the tree, and then I'm astonished. There's her two cubs. They were sleeping in the tree. So I'm then in this position. I'm not between her and her two cubs, but I'm fairly nearby. And you think to the old trope, oh, never get between a mama bear and her cubs. And I certainly would not want to do that, and don't recommend anybody does. But I was in the vicinity of them. And at one point during this get up sequence, the mother bear, she lifted her head and she turned to me. She just looked right at me. And this is while the cubs were actually starting to climb down the tree. And I looked back at her, and, we can't say with any certainty what this means, but my feeling in that interaction was we had a deal. She was looking at me and she acknowledged that I was there, and she acknowledged that she knew I was there. And I think she actually knew what I was doing with a camera on a tripod, because there's a lot of people who film bears in that area. And I think she correctly surmised this is somebody who's not a threat to me or my cubs.
Yeah.
And she then just turned away and kind of went back on her side and let the cubs come down and play at the bottom of the tree with me there. So we'd negotiated what the situation was, is my feeling and my sense there. And there was no problems. She didn't get up and run at me or charge at me. I certainly didn't get any closer or didn't do anything that was threatening. So these animals are so incredibly intelligent and interesting, and I believe conflict averse was my situation. Yep. With dealing with them. They actually don't want to be in conflict with people. They will come around people from time to time because there are attractants, or in some cases, and some of the experts have said this, and I tend to believe them, mother bears and young bears will come down and hang around communities because it's in their best interests to be around people, because there's a level of protection from more powerful male bears that tend to occupy the best pieces of land in the nearby wilderness. So they're actually with and around people, but they're not seeking connection with people. They're tolerating people, and they'll actually avoid conflict when necessary. They kind of know what we're up to, and they want to be involved in our stuff where they need to be, but they don't want to cause any problems. And that was my view of interacting with these bears, and sort of my takeaway from them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I've only had a handful of interactions with black bears, and all three of them, I think, was the bear seeing me from 20 yards out and just turning and running away every time. That is also my engagement with pretty much every wildlife species that we're told is dangerous, and the opposite of my experience with the ones that aren't, such as squirrels and rabbits and raccoons, who are too often fed and end up approaching people. But I do think it's very interesting how many people have these big fears of black bears. And as you talked about, sort of that experience of watching this mother sort of wake up and see that you're there and understand, well, you're not a threat and my cubs are okay, I'm going to hang out more and just relax, does seem very much like their behavior, from what I have been told. I think one of the situations that can arise then is this instance, and we can get a little bit into it, the bigger news item that occurs that you have as a thread through the documentary series of a woman being killed by a bear outside a farm. And I remember this happening, and I remember the excitement in media and in government and in advocacy and in the community. A lot of people were talking about it. But it then turned out to be something much, much different, which was actually, speculated upon by several people ahead of time. Could you share a bit of the process of sort of watching that story unfold and how you reacted to it as sort of a documentarian or a reporter?
So this is the tragic death of Ping Guo, who was a
Mm-hmm.
woman, I believe in her 40s, and she had gone to a U-pick blueberry farm in the city of Pitt Meadows in August of 21. Pitt Meadows is 35 kilometers east of Vancouver. It's been built up a lot in recent years and become a bedroom community of suburbs. But traditionally, it was a farming community. It's a very flat area, and there's a lot of good land there. There's a lot of blueberry farms there. It's also an area that interfaces the nearby wildlife and the Cascade Mountains, and there's a lot of black bears coming through that area. And it's one of these places like the North Shore where there's been a lot of black bears killed and a lot of conflict between people and black bears. So the report broke on the headlines that woman was found mauled to death by animals in a blueberry farm. This was in broad daylight, by the way, I think on a Saturday.
Yep.
And a black bear was suspected. So that headline right away travels, as we were discussing, really fast, went around the world, and certainly was something that was remembered in Canada and in the greater Vancouver area. Because what does it say? We've got a killer black bear on the loose. We've got a killer black bear on the loose that mauled, possibly ate a woman. I mean, you don't get a more sensational headline than this. And it also, of course, a very serious incident for the authorities to respond to and deal with properly. So the media descended on that location. The yellow tape was up. The RCMP were on the scene investigating. And one of the things that you could observe right away, and of course this would be the case if there was a bear that had killed somebody, was the conservation officer service were there en masse. There were a lot of them. I don't have this confirmed, but I was told by some of the people in the community that they brought in some special group, I think, called the Predator Response Team that I think would deal with a predator that had hurt a human and was still on the loose, a cougar or a bear or a grizzly. So this was going on. Then, after the initial splash of that headline, we didn't hear anything. It just kind of went away. And you know how things work in the news business. Stories pop up and then they go away and they're constantly eclipsed by new events and people move on. Mm-hmm. This was also in the thick of the pandemic when a lot of attention was elsewhere. I mean, there could be, an announcement from the government at any minute that would be the big headline.
Yeah.
But I, of course, because I was starting to immerse myself in this and I'd already started production of the film, I was very interested in what had happened in Pitt Meadows. And I continued to follow it along. And after about 6 months, I became suspicious about this story because we were offered no closure from any of the authorities. We didn't hear anything officially from that you would expect we would hear the Conservation Officer Service to say to the public, yes, we tracked down a large male black bear that had signs of having mauled the body, and that bear was destroyed, would of course be the word they would use. Well, we didn't hear that. We heard nothing.
Yeah.
And I started calling them. What's the story? What happened in Pitt Meadows and on the blueberry farm? Sorry, that case is still under investigation. We can't say anything. So I'm like, well, what's under investigation and why? And of course, they wouldn't say what the investigation was. They initially said it was an RCMP investigation. And I thought that was strange because to me, that would tell me, so there's the possibility here that maybe she was a victim of foul play. Is that what's going on here? Mm-hmm. Well, if that's the case, we should be hearing from the RCMP that they're on the lookout for a murder or something. And well, that wasn't the case. So I knew something was going on. About another 4 or 5 months later, so getting close to the 1 year anniversary, we learned that there was now a civil lawsuit that had been filed in connection with this. And this was a lawsuit that was filed on behalf of the relatives of the deceased woman of Ping Guo, and they were suing the owners of the blueberry farm. And so, because this wasn't part of the government's criminal justice system or the conservation officers, information chain of command, this was in the civil courts. So we were able to see what the argument was. And the argument in this case was that Ping Guo was not killed by black bear, but she was killed by dogs, specifically two Rottweilers that had escaped from the nearby property. So, okay, getting back to if it bleeds, it leads. Well, this is a whopper story then, if this is true.
Yeah.
Of course, the civil lawsuit really didn't have much backup. The family didn't want to talk to the media. And I was, following up on this and investigating this. And one of the things we couldn't find out was if there had been dogs on the adjacent property, wouldn't that have been known or established by the city's animal control people? Because cities generally are responsible for vicious dogs in the neighborhood. But another year went on, and I continued to investigate this and ended up having to actually, and this is old school reporter stuff, go out and canvass the neighborhood and start knocking on doors. And I did. And I talked to all the neighbors in the vicinity, and they told another shocking story, which is that there were two Rottweilers that had been living on the property next to where this happened. And they had been a menace in the neighborhood for years. They'd broken out a couple of times. They'd attacked somebody on a tree farm nearby about a year before Ping Guo was killed. He was hospitalized, but survived. And the neighbors had been complaining about these dogs for a long time. And then here's the whopper here, that after Ping Guo died, about a year after that, the dogs actually mauled and killed their owner on that property. So this became this incredible story. And I ended up going to the city of Pitt Meadows and saying, hey, tell us, what's the history of your interaction with these dogs on this property? How was it, A, they were allowed to stay on the property after the first attack that preceded Ping Guo's death? How was it they were left on the property after she died? And then what happened after they killed their owner? And they just immediately clammed up, and their lawyers sent me a letter saying, you have no right to this information, and buzz off. And I don't think that worked well for them, because that became a big story in the local news. And I reported that for my station for Global BC. So in the end, what we had here was a situation where a woman is killed. She was killed by dogs. And this was subsequently confirmed by the BC Coroner's Service years later. But for years, the public had been left with the impression that it was bears that had done it. And that really misled people about the threat. And that fed into all of these problems and these optics surrounding this issue with black bears. And we've never had it actually confirmed from the BC Conservation Officer Service. Did you kill any black bears? I have had off the record information that they killed at least 2 bears. And some of the bear people who live in the Pitt Meadows area, and by that I mean the people who pay attention to the bears, and Brian Nawin is one of them, they say they heard from the local farmers that maybe 3 bears were killed. So we ended up with this terrible situation where first a woman was mauled to death by dogs, but then an incorrect decision was made, likely because of our misconceptions about black bears. Conservation is called in, they pounced, and they went and very likely killed a number of bears wrongfully, innocent bears that had nothing to do with her death. And then simultaneously, another staggering handling of this by the city of Pitt Meadows that they couldn't even deal with these killer dogs at this point. So that ended up being the situation. I mean, you really just couldn't make something like this up. I mean, this was a true crime story that just sort of inserted itself into this larger picture that I was doing about black bears. And we're still trying to figure out exactly what happened here and why. But I think at the end of the day, some really bad decisions were made about black bears that have everything to do with our miscategorization of them, our misperceptions of them.
It is a tragedy. The entire story, it's almost Shakespearean in how tragic it is at every turn for everybody involved, not just for the unfortunate poor woman who was killed, but then you have these dogs, who knows why and how they are that way. You have black bears who may have been killed. You have community members not getting information about their safety. A family left questioning things. It's, it is very, very upsetting to hear about.
Can I just add one thing too on this? And this speaks particularly to us, and I imagine your audience is probably largely Canadian, but we have really weak and ineffective freedom of information laws in Canada. And I've been banging on about this for a long time. And again, I'm the cranky old guy in the newsroom now who remembers how things used to be, right? And
right.
Well, I mean, in this case, things never were open in Canada, but we as Canadians collectively like to think of ourselves as a progressive and mostly civilized country where we have a government that works, and things like transparency and freedom of information and citizens' ability to know what's going on in their government are bedrock principles that we have. And most people, I talk to them all the time, would certainly think that we're ahead of a place like the United States with all of its problems, which we don't need to get into. When in actual fact, that's completely wrong. Just by comparison, the United States is light years ahead of us in freedom of information and ability to get answers from police forces, from cities, from provincial wildlife management agencies. We can't get anything. It's very hard. And when I say we can't get anything, well, maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration. You can fill out and file a freedom of information request in Canada. But the government doesn't want to say anything, they don't have to, and they usually don't. And usually what you're going to get back is a bunch of redacted papers, blacked out. People want to know what that means. And this after you spend a lot of time and money sending it in. If you make an appeal to try to get some of the redactions removed, agencies will frequently have months, if not years, to deal with the appeal and effectively shut you down through bureaucratic obfuscation. And they know exactly how that works, and they use it all of the time. Canadians are regularly told by our governments and our police agencies, we'll tell you what you need to know. Experts are in charge. Experts have made the decisions. Shut up and go along, and no, you can't know this. And we've generally, I think the reason why we don't have good freedom of information laws is because we've kind of accepted it. And, in investigating this, and a lot of this stuff is really bad when it comes to these controversial wildlife interaction, quote unquote, management practices that we have. If you want to find out from the BC government what the methods that they're using in the highly controversial helicopter-borne aerial wolf kill that they just did another version of it this past winter, good luck, because they're not going to tell you anything, because they know that if the truth comes out about their methods and what they're doing to wolves, the public will be so alarmed that the program would have to be shut down. So they keep it secret. And this is a real disturbing thing, because this essentially means that they know what they're doing is politically impossible. It does not have the endorsement of the people who, they govern with their consent, and that they have to keep it secret. If a government is doing something that can only exist in secret, you have to question whether they should be doing it. And a lot of this overlaps on our problem with black bears. To the extent that the things that are being done to black bears are known, would we allow them to happen? And I think in many cases, as people find out, the answer is no. You know, one of the debates we have out here in BC that's ongoing is activists are calling for the conservation officer service to wear body cams so that, you know, there can be some record of what happened and what actions were taken and why. I mean, I think that's probably a generally good idea. More police transparency is generally good.
And they are police. Let's not forget
and
that.
they are police. Yes, they're peace officers.
Yep.
They have weapons. They have training on weapons, and they have the authority to use them. But we are so far behind widespread use and management of body cams that I just don't see that as being something that we would be reasonably able to establish. You know, many American police forces are, again, years ahead of us in using body cams and actually releasing it to the public. And I would be fine if they were given body cams and told they have to use them. But I suspect in Canada, with the way our laws are written right now, for them to have body cams, that's kind of a so what thing, because it's only meaningful if average citizens are able to quickly and effectively be able to get the video. And I don't see our governments releasing that. So I think, you know, Canadians, we really need to think. And, you know, freedom of information is an arcane area, and it doesn't affect most people in their daily lives, but it's definitely something that we need to talk about. And we need to come to the realization that we have really bad laws, and they were really ineffective and did not serve the public, certainly in the case of this Pitt Meadows situation, where you had a whole community, a city that went for years thinking bears had killed somebody and it was dogs. This is a terrible thing.
Well, and on the note of the FOIs, for your newsroom rantings, you can also remind them of what it was like back in the day when we got the print version of everything and not a CD-ROM or an email with a download, and it was a giant package and it was 900 pages, and you sat at your desk and that was your job for 2 days, was sitting and going page at a time, looking at redactions and making notes. It's weird the things you start to miss at some point.
Well, I'm sure they would have you back if you're interested in getting back to plowing through FOI responses.
Well, they need someone to do it, and the temp won't anymore. But I think it does lead in nicely to a question I wanted to wrap on. And that's, as we're talking about this, and you bring up the great point about trust of government and media reporting and all of these different aspects that go into how we view bears that you talk about, or you show, through the documentary. I'm curious if you have tips for viewers of television news, of reading news, of watching documentaries that could help them hone in on some of those critical thinking skills. So when we do hear from the Conservation Officer Service about something, or we do hear the minister make an announcement regarding policies, there's a degree of speculation, but not necessarily the complete dismissal of all media as lies, because I think that is just the other end of that spectrum and equally, if not more, harmful.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I had a lot of experience dealing with the fake news crowd in recent years. Any working reporter has. And that philosophy and that approach is flat out wrong. I've never lied in a story. I've never made anything up. Also, nor has any reporter who I've ever worked with in the mainstream media. Now,
I can say the same.
Yeah, fake news is just incorrect. There is no conspiracy from the top to manipulate the mainstream news media. It's never happened. It's not happening. Now, that being said, does the media make mistakes? Absolutely. Some of them are worse than others. Do they make mistakes of omission within the stories that they're doing, and also mistakes of omission just within the stories that they choose to cover? Absolutely. All of the time. Does that have to do with some conspiracy to sway public opinion one way or another? Absolutely not. And it never has. And it has to do with the fact that the world is a chaotic place. Nobody has all of the answers and all of the information. And journalists in newsrooms are trying to get their product out on a timely basis in a way that works for whatever their delivery mechanism is. That's usually what's going on. There have been a few bad actors, but they've been astonishingly few and far between.
Yeah.
So in terms of people watching stories and seeing stories, and summer's happening now, and there's going to be more stories about bear attacks, and hopefully there won't be any cases. But when people hear those stories and consume them, well, one thing I would say is when you read the line where the police or the wildlife officer makes the statement that the bear was euthanized or the bear was destroyed, I think it's worth just knowing right straight up that if they say that, that's spin. And it's an unfortunate kind of spin. And I've actually told them this. I've told some of the people in government, you need to stop saying this because it reduces your credibility, because it's spin. Just say you killed the bear. Now they're very hesitant to do that. But I think that's what average people can do, is anytime you see it was euthanized, you can likely replace euthanized with killed. Now, there may be a case where they do, and there are cases where they do euthanize animals, and they should really, this is why it's so bad that they're using this as spin, because they're not able to correctly talk about the times when they are actually euthanizing an animal. So that's one thing. The other thing I think is, and people listening to this podcast are curious about this particular issue and likely have feelings about it already. But anytime we hear government officials talk about managing this population, I think that's another thing that you stop and you question and think that through. What does that mean to manage a population? These populations of black bears, for instance, have been evolving in these ecosystems since the retreat of the glaciers at the last ice age, right? 30,000 years ago. The ecosystems manage the populations of creatures in them, not people.
Yep.
That's what we've seen through 99.9% of the time that we've had life on Earth. This is only a recent development that we think that we have, first, the moral authority, and then second, the actual capability to effectively manage things properly or successfully. It's questionable whether we do. I believe in many cases we don't. So question it when we hear that these populations need to be managed and what that means. And if we are going to manage them, well, who sets the rules about this, about how it's done? And the answer is, in a place like Canada, we do, and citizens do. Since we're wrapping up here, I wanted to end with something, and this was also covered in the film, and this is a positive side to this, is that citizens' actions really can amount to powerful change. And there are a couple of communities in British Columbia that didn't sit around waiting for the government doing FOIs because they correctly knew that that was probably a waste of time. They wanted to protect the bears that they interface with in their communities. Lions Bay is one of them, and I profiled the village of Lions Bay. It's about 30 kilometers north of Vancouver on Howe Sound. Mm-hmm. They got together about 10 years ago, and they realized too many bears were being killed, and they wanted to do something about it. So they did very simple things. They got together and they started talking about it. What can we do to manage attractants? And they didn't go out and tell people you can't have a fruit tree, you got to cut down that apple tree or anything like that. But they just made enough people first aware that, those apples sitting there on the ground after they've ripened and fallen, the bears are going to be on that, and they're going to be in your yard, and they're going to be coming through. So you might think about collecting them, getting rid of them or doing something with them. You'll have fewer bears.
Yeah.
And these sorts of things started to happen. Then, and this was really impressive, they realized that the primary attractant issue, of course, was garbage. So what they did was they identified the areas in their neighborhood. And of course, this would change on a weekly basis during the period of the year when bears are out. And they prioritized garbage pickup in the areas where they'd had the most bear activity, meaning that garbage would be left on the curb for a much shorter period of time. And those areas would get picked up first. Just those two things resulted in a transformative change in bear-human conflicts there. And they went from a situation where for years, there was a few bears getting killed by conservation every year to about a 10-year period where not a single bear was killed. They did it on their own. They didn't get any grants. They didn't fight with the government over it. And I think actually that's the most powerful thing that average people can do if you live in a place where you interface with black bears. Not to mention that interacting with black bears in a peaceful way can be one of the most rewarding and uplifting things you can do and experience as a Canadian and as a British Columbian. It's changed my life. And I think that if people looked at it that way, that we could have these experiences where we can actually peacefully get close to these animals and they continue to live around us, we can feel this uplift from that. And this can be done. We just got to put our minds into it and behind it.
Bears in Our Backyards is available to rent or buy on Vimeo and will be coming soon to other streaming platforms. Links are available in this week's show notes in your podcast player app and at defenderradio.com. I want to thank Paul for taking time to chat with me, and I encourage everyone to check out Bears in Our Backyards to learn more about the specific issues facing black bears in BC and how our individual actions can play a big role in the successes of wildlife coexistence. I also want to say a big thank you to you for joining me. Remember to subscribe to or follow the Defender Radio podcast in your preferred app, or to sign up for email updates, including notices of new episodes at thefurbearers.com. Until next time, I'm Michael Howie for Defender Radio and the Fur Bearers, reminding you to stay informed and stay strong.